You want to turn in the scriptures back to Mark chapter 7, where I read for the gospel this morning. And that'll help you as we go. And the key phrase I want us to focus on just as we get started is this declaration that this woman makes. We're only going to handle the first half of what I read, the first story. She said, "Lord, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." Lady, you just said a mouthful. The woman was a Canaanite. Now, according to Matthew's rendering of this, the story appears in both Matthew and Mark. According to Matthew's rendering of this passage, she lived in an area along the Mediterranean coast, north of Israel, not far from Beirut, Lebanon. What that means is that she's not a Jew. What it meant to somebody born Jewish in the first century was that she was very much one of the goyim, the outsiders, the others. We've talked about that before. And to be a goyim was to be completely separated from Israel. You had nothing to do with Jews. And they didn't even like doing business with the goyim. They were a very isolated people. More than that, she was a believer. If she was a Syrophoenician, she was a believer in a pantheon of gods that numbered over 30. Not the Roman pantheon over which Jupiter was the king, or the Greek pantheon whose chief god was Zeus. The people who lived in the area called Syria Phoenicia in Jesus' day shared Semitic ancestral roots with the Jews, and they did recognize one god as chief among the gods. They called this god El, ruler of the universe, son of the god Dagon, rider of the clouds, almighty, Lord of the earth. They were a people who worshiped, as we would say, God in nature in many ways, Lord of the earth. The Jews called him by another name, Baal. And their God, Yahweh, had expressly told them throughout the centuries to have nothing to do with the worship of Baal. The Old Testament prophet Habakkuk, writing around 628 BC, said, "What use is an idol that a craftsman should carve it, or an image that a teacher of lies? For its maker trusts in his own creation. He makes idols that cannot speak. Woe to him who says to wood, awaken, or to silent stone, come alive. Can it give guidance? Behold, it is overlaid with gold and silver, and yet there is no breath in it at all." That from a Jewish prophet. And in Exodus 20, God tells the Jews in 3 different ways that he is the one, the only God. He says, "I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the 3rd and the 4th generation of those who hate me, but showing steadfast love to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments." And the 3rd time, "You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain," or takes the name of God lightly. There's just no wiggle room in those commandments, particularly in the 2nd commandment. For a Jew to accept any other god or any representation of a god as having any reality. And that's why this Phoenician woman was an outsider to Jesus and his disciples. She believed a falsehood. She believed something which is not true about the gods, that they have substance. She believed something that was not true about the one God who rules the universe. She believed falsehoods that had been taught to generations of her people. There's just no wiggle room in this. But ask yourself for a moment, where was Jesus when he ran into this woman? You see, she hadn't come down from Lebanon to Capernaum, in Galilee, where Jesus had his headquarters. She didn't trek all the way over there to meet with him. He had left Capernaum and had traveled first across the Sea of Galilee to Gennesaret, where he had cast out demons and healed the sick, in chapter 6 of Mark. And his works were causing such a stir among the people that the Sanhedrin had sent a delegation up the Jordan River to Gennesaret and challenged Jesus on the fine points of the law. We saw in the message last week that Jesus had instructed his disciples not to observe the complex traditions about ritually washing your hands before touching practically anything. Because ritual washing, he said, cannot make you clean. Strict separation from others, separation from the unclean goyim, cannot make you clean either. Uncleanness, he said, comes from the heart. After this, instead of going back to Capernaum, regrouping and setting up headquarters again, Jesus took his disciples on a journey of nearly 100 miles, all the way over to the Mediterranean coast, to Tyre and Sidon, just to prove his point. He wanted to get well out of the Jewish regions because he needed to go where he could teach all about dogs and justice and children. All about dogs and justice and children. Jesus had told his disciples in Mark 6 how to begin the process of establishing justice. He was sending them out in groups of 2. Now, in a parallel passage in Luke 10, Jesus tells them, whatever house you enter, first say, peace be to this house. And if a son of peace is there, your peace will rest upon him. And so if you're reading Mark 7 with me, you'll see in the second half of verse 24, and he entered a house. See, he'd sent his disciples out on a mission, and when he went out on mission, he told them that the sign would be peace. And so it says he entered a house and did not want anyone to know, and yet he could not be hidden. Jesus had picked a house in one of the villages along the coast of the Mediterranean and had literally walked up to the door and knocked. It's important to know that at this point, it did not matter to Jesus whether the person on the other side of the door was a Jew or not. It didn't matter to Jesus when he knocked on that door whether this was a Jew in the house or whether it was one of the separated goyim. And that's key to understanding this story. See, because justice doesn't begin with ethnic or religious purity. Justice begins somewhere else. If you enter a conversation or a situation and you assume that the person you're speaking to hates you, there is no possibility of you ever establishing a relationship between you. You will never build a friendship with your neighbor or coworker if you begin by sizing them up and judging their motives. Oh, I suppose they're nice enough, but they're different. Their skin is a different color. They speak with a thick foreign accent. They wear funny clothes. You see, the narrative of the other that was put out on TV from 1948 until around 1990 was always that the other was a communist and spoke with a funny Russian accent. Until the mid-70s, people of color were virtually absent from the American airwaves or were relegated to service roles as cast members as cast members in the TV shows, as gang members, as maids, as people in servile roles. Since the 90s, that narrative has turned around to fear of anybody with a Middle Eastern heritage. Since around 2000, the politics of the other has also become the politics of America, and we have learned to believe that just because somebody is a member of the other political party, they are the enemy. And the list of others goes on and on and on. And sometimes we're not even conscious that we do it. The Jews of Jesus' day knew some of this politic of division. The Pharisees believed resurrection was possible. The Sadducees didn't believe in the resurrection. And so these two political groups, if you will, within Judaism were always at odds, always keeping one another at arm's length, even though they shared a common belief in Yahweh. And so it was that Jesus left Gennesaret and he trekked 100 miles west to Lebanon. And Jesus walked up to a random house in a random village in Lebanon. The homeowner opened the door. That, by the way, was the first hopeful sign. Jesus greeted the homeowner by saying, "Shalom." I know that's what he did, because that's what he instructed his disciples to do whenever they entered a village. So the homeowner opened the door, and Jesus said, "Shalom," peace. I like to think that the homeowner returned the favor, but they might have said something back to Jesus like, "Salam." Peace is one of those concepts that seems to transcend language, seems to transcend religion, seems to transcend culture. And that was the beginning of understanding between them. Jesus didn't stop being Jewish, as we're about to find out. The people who took Jesus and his disciples in and fed them and gave them shelter and ate with them and listened to them and maybe learned a few words of Hebrew did not stop being pantheists. Peace is the calling card of justice. For those of you who may not know, Islam did not begin among the Arab peoples until 700 years after Jesus went to this town in Lebanon. And just to be accurate, the people probably didn't speak Arabic or anything like it. But what I'm trying to establish here is that there was every reason on both sides of the door of that house why this was not an acceptable place for Jesus and his friends to camp out. Peace, you see, in any language, peace is the calling card of justice. But let's get back to the woman. Now that we have a sense of where Jesus is and who he is with, Mark 7:25 says, a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit heard of him and came and fell down at his feet. There's that word unclean again. Understand, that's the word that Mark, a Jew, would use to describe the situation. The woman was a Syrophoenician from Lebanon. She had no such religious understanding. She didn't get that her daughter had an unclean spirit. She would have rightly said that her daughter was demon-possessed. She understood that. This didn't make her daughter ritually unclean in her world, but it would have made her daughter ritually unclean in his. And it also would have made her anathema, so that she could not be touched, could not be in the presence of Jesus or of his disciples or of any Jew who wanted to remain clean with regards to the law. So the woman entered the house and she went straight to where Jesus was, and she fell down at Jesus' feet, not because she believed that he was El or Baal in human form, but because she believed that he was able to help her daughter. That's all she cared about. Matthew's version of the story goes into a little more detail and adds that Jesus at first said nothing. She fell at his feet, and Jesus at first said nothing. He just sort of stood there, sat there, whichever it was. And we get the edge of the Pharisees' complaint to Jesus from way back over in Gennesaret in the disciples who begged Jesus to send the woman away. They were afraid that they were going to catch whatever it was, that they were going to become unclean, that they wouldn't be acceptable in Judaism. They begged him to send her away. She's a goyim. She's the other. Jesus, if we have contact with her, it will make us unclean. Jesus, please send her away. But Jesus silences their pleas. Their pleas. In one sentence. Here it comes. Let the children be fed first, for it is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. He's not saying that their Jewishness doesn't count for anything. They are and continue to be the covenant children of Israel. And Jesus assures them of that and of his care for the children of Israel with this statement. But this story is about dogs and justice and children. And Jesus intends to balance God's blessings on the children of Israel and blessings for the others, the outsiders, the goyim, dogs, if you will, on the pinpoint of justice. He wants to balance the blessings of the children and of dogs on the pinpoint of justice. Shalom is the calling card of justice. The woman was made bold by Jesus' statement, since he didn't expressly leave others out. So she cried out all the more, "Lord, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." As I said before, Jesus might well have replied, "Lady, you just said a mouthful." Now, don't make too much of the woman's declaration calling Jesus Lord. It's a common term in the first century, and it simply tells us that she saw herself in extreme need and was willing to put herself in the position of a slave, one who calls somebody their master, their Lord, in order to save her daughter. That's all that this implies. Now, let's examine Jesus' statement, though, for a minute. Let the children be fed first. The implication is actually that there's plenty of bread to go around. Plenty of bread to go around. Everyone look at me. Plenty of bread to go around. There's plenty of bread to go around, and then some. And it's a great figure of speech, and it's a very potent one right now. You know why? Because not long before going out to Lebanon on his trips that he'd been taking, Jesus had sat and he'd taught a very large crowd, and 5,000 people were fed miraculously. You know what they were fed? Bread, right? And some fish. And immediately after his meeting with the woman, Jesus went back to the other side, to the east side of the Sea of Galilee, trekked that same 100 miles back with his disciples, and there he fed 4,000 more people. You know what he fed them? Bread. There you go. See? It was a very potent sort of an analogy to use. This summer we memorized John 6:35. You remember it? Let's do it. References 4.5. John 6:35. I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me shall not hunger. Whoever believes in me shall never thirst. I am the bread of life, Jesus said. In both cases, Jesus fed the crowds bread and fish. In both cases, his disciples took up huge baskets full of crumbs that were left over. What's the message? There was enough bread to feed an army and more. In both cases, Jesus was in areas where crowds were not exclusively Jewish. The first time he fed the 5,000 in Galilee of the Gentiles. That's the actual name of the Galilee region. Why? Because it was a mixed group up there. It wasn't just Jews. It was Jews mixed with Gentiles living up there. And when he fed the 4,000 over in Gennesaret, it was even a lower count on the Jewish side. It was primarily a non-Jewish audience. Jesus had fed the lost children of Israel first and would feed them again. But in both cases, mixed in among the predominantly Jewish crowd, there were most assuredly Gentiles. And Jesus fed them too. This Syrophoenician woman was not alone in receiving crumbs from the master's table. Jesus also cast out a legion of demons from a man over in Gennesaret, a Gerasene they're called. And this Gerasene was no way a Jew. He healed a Roman soldier's servant. That wasn't a Jewish person. And through his preaching, he transformed the life of a woman from Samaria, a Samaritan, somebody that the Jews hated. None of these were Jews by birth. What did old Simeon say when he held Jesus as a baby at his dedication in the temple? My eyes have seen your salvation that you have prepared in the presence of all peoples, a light for revelation to the Gentiles and for glory to your people Israel. Justice for children and for the dogs. Now, was Jesus just toying with the woman when he said, let the children be fed first? Did he not intend to fulfill the woman's request from the beginning? In Matthew's version, he goes so far as to say, I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Oh boy. Was Jesus being cruel when he referred to her in a not so veiled way as a dog? One of Jesus' key teachings is given in the Sermon on the Mount. It may help us in this. It's Matthew 5. Jesus said, do not give dogs what is holy, and do not throw your pearls before pigs, lest they trample them underfoot and turn and attack you. And then he said, with no break, in the Sermon on the Mount, and then he said, ask, and it will be given you. Seek, and you will find. Knock, and it will be opened to you. For the one who seeks finds, the one who asks receives, and to the one who knocks it will be opened. Or which one of you, if his son asks him for bread, will give him a stone? Or if he asks for a fish, will give him a serpent? If you then who are evil know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father who is in heaven give good things to those who ask him? Lord, the woman said, as she knelt on the floor in front of Jesus, I know I'm not one of the children of Israel, but I'm asking you, I'm begging you, help my little girl. So I ask you, what separates children from dogs? I know different cultures treat their dogs very differently, and I don't know how they did it in those days, but Jema and I are empty nesters. Our kids grew up and left home, and we started having grandchildren who show up periodically. And about 9 years ago, once the kids were all out of the house, we got a dachshund. He's our substitute child. And any of you who know that, I'm admitting a psychological defect here, you understand. You start to treat this cute little dog as if it was part of the family, right? They're getting a lot of, I get more amens on that one than I do on a lot of stuff. Wow. So what if I talk about Jesus? Would you say amen to that? Yeah, right. Okay, good. That'll loosen you up a little bit. All right, so you treat the dog like part of your family, even especially if it's a small dog. What separates children from dogs in Jesus' world? That's the question. The test of whether somebody is deserving of the same mercy given to the children, it turns out, isn't their pedigree. Jesus healed Gentiles. Jesus cast out demons from Gentiles. Jesus preached to Gentiles. He treated them the same. Though his main ministry was to Israel, he knew the rest of the world was living in the same darkness that Israel was living in, and they needed the same Savior. Now, in the end, I don't know why he used the metaphor of dogs, except perhaps to offer the greatest contrast he could think of, and the woman picked up on it. There they were in coastal Lebanon. Was Jesus there for a vacation? I don't think so. Look, calling her a dog is only an insult if dogs and Gentiles and others are to be kept out of the house. But the dog that the woman is referring to is also a part of the household, as I just demonstrated, and sits under the master's table. That's not an insult. This kind of dog is kept and fed and loved. And so the woman didn't take Jesus' words as an insult. She took Jesus' words as shalom, and shalom is the calling card of justice. How you receive someone's words is just as important as the words themselves. The woman cries out boldly for justice now, even a justice she is not sure that she deserves from Jesus. And she's lowering herself from the master's level. She's lowering herself not just to the level of one of the children in the house, who, by the way, didn't have any rights in the first century either. She's lowering herself all the way down, not just to the level of a household slave. They didn't have any rights in the first century, but she's lowering herself all the way to the position of the family pet. And she's seeking justice in shalom. If you combine Matthew's account and Mark's account at this point, Jesus probably said something like this to her. He probably said, "What great faith! For this statement, you may go your way. The demon has left your daughter." Faith is the child of humility. Jesus said in another place that we need to approach God as children. The woman engaged with Jesus and in humility sought and received justice. I wish I could tell you that there's a formula for getting what you want from God. I wish it was as simple as take a humble attitude and God will heal your disease. God will heal your distress. God will heal your infirmity. I wish I could say that. I can't. Jesus did not heal all who came from every crowd. But Jesus did heal many who came, both Jew and Gentile. Jesus did and does heal. The kids are learning this morning in their classes out of Proverbs 22 that Grace read for us a few minutes ago. Whoever sows injustice will reap calamity, and the rod of God's fury will be upon him, or the rod of their fury will fail. It can be translated either way. Whoever has a bountiful eye will be blessed. Another way of putting that would be, whoever has a peaceful eye, whoever sees peace will be blessed. For he shares his bread with the poor. Jesus shared his bread, the bread that he is. And he taught his disciples that day to day they were to do the same thing. And he taught his disciples that day to share what had been given to them with anyone who comes. With anyone who comes. Whether they look different, or speak different, or dress different. With a humble heart of shalom. Faith is the child of humility. You cannot have faith in Jesus unless you come with a humble attitude. And the woman came with a supremely humble attitude. And it was the beginning of her faith in Christ. Shalom is the calling card of justice. You cannot receive justice unless you come in shalom. You cannot offer justice unless you go in shalom. If you are sharing the bread of life through the shalom of justice with the children and with the dogs, Jesus will be honored. Justice will be served. God will be in your midst. And the door to really understanding Jesus will have been opened. Let's pray.